Right. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody enjoyed the last session with Aptian. Want to thank everybody for joining Cartonize. In a second, I'm going to introduce you to Cam Stout, who is the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships with Packsize. We'll be talking about sustainability that pays. Really excited about this as well. Most of you are probably aware that we've expanded our relationship with Packsize, as kind of partners, and so super excited to see this. But before I introduce Cam, I got a couple of housekeeping things for folks that might be new that haven't joined the previous sessions. First off, just to let everybody know again that this session will be recorded and available on demand for viewing after we wrap up today. We'll email the recording of the session within 24 hours. Please again ask as many questions as you'd like in the Q&A box. And then we'll get to as many questions as we can. If we don't get to the questions, we will email you to follow up on the conversation. From an engagement perspective, there's, if you'd like to kind of hit some of the action buttons, if you'd like to talk to the presenter, there's a book a demo option as well. And then we've got a couple more sessions. So hope that you will join us for the rest of those sessions. There'll be a bright pink pop-up window that will take you to the next session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Cam Stout.
Cool. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak today. So the topic that I'm going to cover today is just sustainability that pays. So as an intro, this is about packaging automation, and the impacts that it can have not only from a sustainability standpoint, but then also from a bottom line standpoint. So the industry data is relatively light, right? So some of this will be from kind of a Packsize lens and with data that we've aggregated by using, the tools that we've got, specifically Packurate's Pack Simulate software. So, with that, that's kind of the best way that I can tell this story. So I'll start off by just talking about pain points across the supply chain. Right now, through both regulatory action and also just consumer preference, especially around younger consumers, 48% of respondents into the MHI industry report are saying they're under increased pressure to adopt a more sustainable supply chain. So 57% of those businesses are having trouble hiring and retaining qualified workers. You'll see that, and that was mentioned several times throughout today, whether it's aging workforce, whether it's just the lack of attraction of working in the warehouse environment, whatever it might be, it is very difficult not only to hire, but to retain employees. So, and then as it pertains to corrugated has, just like everything else in the world, gotten substantially more expensive. So a 30% increase in corrugated costs since 2020. And then, if that wasn't enough, or if those pressures weren't high enough, then you have FedEx and UPS that have been increasing their base carrier rates, and especially around larger items. Those have been the highest impact and the highest, I guess, the biggest hit, as far as a cost perspective is concerned. So for the most part, a lot of warehouses, I think, for the past decade, I heard AK kind of mention this, is that, it's been about picking efficiency and optimizing picking, optimizing labor associated with picking. And really what we want to talk about today is just, the fact that, packaging is quickly becoming kind of that next frontier. A lot of people have already invested, whether it's AutoStore, whether it's AMRs, whether it's, more traditional kind of conveyor, fed pick modules. Like, everyone's really optimized kind of the picking, right? So now it's time to, take a look and say, what else can we do? So with this, in e-com, this is kind of the approach of, packaging automation. So first you take a look at picking, which I just talked about. But, when you introduce picking and packing in the same step, you're able to do a few things. So you're able to just really determine carton flow. So with carton flow, you can feed, whether it's, feeding directly onto the mouth of an AMR, whether it's, feeding up to an AutoStore port and having, box buffers built in, but you can really control carton flow, and you can control picking and the, I guess the order in which those take place. We can also reduce material. So material reduction is extremely important. just from, cutting into that corrugated cost, as I was saying. But then, more and more states are also introducing, EPR regulations. So, you are responsible for the way that you are packaging your products going forward. And I've got a little bit more on that and kind of what that means from a regulatory perspective. But labor keeps getting more and more expensive. And really, like, what we hate to see is that, you've got this beautiful pick engine, you've invested millions of dollars into how you're going to pick your products out of storage, but then one of two things can happen. Number one, it just goes into just a sea of pack stations, right? Where you've just got, you've optimized, taken 70% of your labor away through picking, but then, you're picking at a rate that is just, is extremely slow. And then the second is that you just have a bottleneck at packaging, because a standard individual can package roughly 55 cartons an hour. So that's right around a minute per order for them to, really, and it really degrades things. So, when you're taking a look and you're saying, okay, if you have picking and packing taking place in the same step, then it's kind of a 1 + 1 = 3 from a labor perspective, and then from an overall throughput. Because, if you aren't optimized packing, it's kind of like a V8 engine, in a Lamborghini that has an exhaust pipe that's a 1/4 inch, right? So, and then really the very end is that when you have high quality, right size packaging, it's protecting your goods in transit. So, I think that anyone that is dealing with direct to consumer shipments knows that just because of consumer behavior, returns are at an all-time high, and they're extremely difficult to deal with. But then, if you are, I guess, wrong sizing your packages, then you're also dealing with returns from damage, which just exacerbates the issue. So, if you do implement automated packaging systems, we can help you with the customer experience, just overall speed and consistency. But, as I mentioned, these are kind of two different ways. And then, we're not a fit for everyone. And then we're also not the only company that exists that provides these some of this technology. So, the point is just like to do something, right? And this is what we've seen from like a sustainability perspective. So, I mentioned earlier in the call that we have used Pack Simulate software, in order to determine just what our impacts are going to be. Like, what is your current state versus what is the future state? And we've aggregated all of this information. So, in just under a year, we've been able to perform 38 million parcel audits. So with that, the outcomes have been 43% reduction in cubic volume, a 32% increase in fill rate, 84% less void fill used. And then at a metric that doesn't get talked about very much when it comes to right sizing, or if you're cartonizing well and you're right sizing well, it's just the overall carton reduction. So we do see an average of 4% reduction in the actual cartons that need to be shipped. And that's the best way. It doesn't matter like size, weight, and things like that. If you're taking a carton out of the mix, there's no better carton than the one that doesn't get sent, right? Because it in turn just becomes freer at a much lower cost. So the tree's impact, is very large, just from producing paper and the reduction in that. But then the biggest one and the biggest sustainability value that we've got is taking trailers off the road. So you're just taking what would be a non-optimized package that is roughly 43% too large, right? And then you times that by the amount of trucks that are going to take place. And basically, we're just cubing into a truck to say we can reduce 43% of the trailers that get used per year. And that's a tremendous amount of carbon. That's a tremendous amount of diesel. But then, the other part about it is it's also like a tremendous amount of infrastructure that doesn't need to exist. So I think I heard Bob talking earlier today just about, before the advent of dimensional shipping, UPS and FedEx were just struggling to keep up because of the amount of air that are in the packages. And then we also, have heard just about e-commerce and how disruptive that is going to be. And that was mentioned in the keynote. but it is, it is one of the most disruptive factors. So if, as e-commerce continues to grow and grow and grow, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, how many, it doesn't matter if these are electric vehicles or trucks, or if they're automated or whatever. It's like, do we really have the infrastructure in North America to be able to handle that amount of shipments, right? And it's going to take a tremendous amount of infrastructure investment to really keep up if trends keep going the way that they do. So, with all that, it's just like, okay, all this is fine and well, right? We've got sustainability impacts, but the reason why I personally like working in automated packaging is because you can have your sustainability, but you can also get paid to do it, right? So, and that's this slide is kind of the key point that I want people to consider. It's just optimizing packaging can have tremendous bottom line impacts, right? So sustainability that pays. What we mean by that is just, with factors like dimensional weight, labor costs, oversized fees, perpetual rate increases, we've been able to take a look and say, okay, with customers where we are able to analyze their order profiles and we actually have FedEx and UPS rate tables, these are the average impacts. So outbound logistics is about 50 cents per order. And then if you're picking into a box, or if you're automating and going into a box last environment, 40 cents in packing savings per order, 7 cents in void fill, and then 13 cents in material savings. So another way to say this is that, we're really almost wiping out your corrugated spend. The average e-commerce carton is roughly 70 to 75 cents per carton, right? And we're giving an impact that is larger than the cost of the actual carton in which things are being shipped. So, this is relatively easy math to do. If there is variance in the products that you're shipping, right? And if there is a right sizing opportunity, pretty easy to say, okay, this is how many orders my warehouse is going to do. This is the average impact that we've seen, and this is around, roughly 20 million orders that we've analyzed. So, we feel very good about the data that we're providing here and what we're talking about today. So, no matter what you do, I think the cost of doing nothing is just continues to go up, right? And I mentioned some of the regulations, but there's a few that I did want to talk about. So in North America, a lot of these are around EPR regulations where, you are accountable for just your environmental impact, including packaging, including the use of plastics. So we've seen those in 6 states. Maryland just announced one this morning around their EPR. And then if you have European operations, then it's all of this, but even more. With PPWR, there is legislation that is actively, in its implementation phase right now, that states that any package that you ship needs to be over 50% full, right? Otherwise, you may be subject to fines. You may be subject to additional regulation. So, that's been a very commonplace, topic for our customers in Europe, and then also, Packsize as being providing an opportunity to optimize those things and to keep you out of regulatory fines and things like that. So the point is that, whether you want to do this now because you see the cost savings, or whether you're going to be regulated to do it, the time is now to start thinking about just, how to attack this problem. So then I've already mentioned just surging labor costs, 30% return rate of, all online orders, as high as 50% in, apparel and footwear, because you've got the dynamics of buy 3, keep 1. And then UPS just continues to raise its surcharges. And I mentioned earlier, the larger packages have been the heaviest hit over the last 2 years, because frankly, they're the biggest strain on UPS and FedEx in general. So, and just Tony mentioned at the top about just our partnership. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't just put in one slide talking about cartonization. So, with this is an example of a customer that has a piece of Packsize equipment, right? And they're fulfilling not all of their orders, but a majority of their orders through Packsize, kind of in a box first environment where we are creating the carton first. But their cartonization does not, is just really not meeting expectations, right? If you've followed Packarit's journey, it's really talking about 3D cartonization versus just liquid fill that has been used in the past. This particular customer had liquid fill cartonization. So with this, what we found is, not only was it impacting just the ability to actually right size, and to hit some of Packsize or on-demand packaging kind of traditional value propositions, but it was also causing labor issues. So with this, what was happening is either the cartons that were being picked into were either drastically underfilled or they were drastically overfilled. So every single carton that got overfilled had to be repacked. So it was taking 5 full-time employees just to do repacks because of the cartonization software. Not to mention leaving $874,000 on the table as far as corrugated savings was concerned. So you can see the impact. So by implementing Packarit, and Packsize together, we were able to, at least on the Packarit portion, the payback was less than a month. And then there was also some edge cases there. So most customers are not just overboxing. They're not just taking things that are already boxed and then, putting them side by side and then putting an overbox on them. Most of them are going to be shipping, multiples. You've got soft goods, you've got hard goods, you've got goods that can be nested, you've got goods that are fragile and need special considerations. You've got items that can be compressed, right? And with this, when you deploy the right cartonization with the right hardware solution, then this is just going to maximize your ROI, right? It's going to maximize your ROI in all of your automation, your automation spend. And 3D cartonization and pick to carton is going to give you the best outcome when it comes to overall labor required for picking and packing, when it comes to overall outbound logistics spend, as it pertains to parcel, and this is just kind of one of many examples that we've seen as we build business cases day in and day out. So I did want to also just show that you don't have to be like this super high volume shipper for some of these things to start making sense. So I've got 3 solutions that we'll talk about. I'm not going to go too in depth about the solutions themselves, but just focusing on kind of the volume and just some of the impacts that they saw. So the first is just a relatively low volume, 366,000 orders per day. The customer was using 7 box SKUs. They run 260 production days, average rate of 176 cartons or orders per hour. So with this, we were able to reduce our transportation spend 647% by cutting the box size nearly in half. And then the investment for Packsize, and some of the other things that went along with it, net savings year 1, $687,000, net savings year 2, $717,000. This customer elected to go with Packsize's pass model, so your upfront costs were relatively approachable. So the second is a medium volume shipper, at least as we look at it, and they were building box towers, and we see this a lot, like manual labor. You are picking the carton, pretty easy for you to switch over to an on-demand system, but you just have 10, 15 people that are building boxes and placing them on conveyors rather than having an automated piece of equipment do it. So material savings was substantial in this case. Freight savings was the biggest lever, as our data usually shows, $1.2 million worth of savings on an annual volume of 884,000, and then we were able to cut 83% of the labor around just actually building these boxes. So that was an additional spend or additional savings of 127,000. So, and then the last one, is just at 2X5s, a goods to person system. A little bit higher volume, so you're going about 400 cartons per hour. 8 box SKUs were used, 9.2% annual shipping savings, 42% reduction in void. So you can see $821,000 in savings there, 1.17 million in savings in year 2. So overall, like I'm showing you these things because I think the I guess the point that I'm really trying to prove is that optimizing packaging, is often forgotten. Other warehouse technologies can take precedence and priorities, but overall, you should be taking a look at optimizing packaging in general. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go with an on-demand system, but it does mean that you should be thinking about, okay, what SKU set, what carton set fits the best for my products. You might just have the same products that you're shipping over and over, and it's a 1-pack, 3-pack, 5-pack. There's other ways to solve this, but if you're not thinking about this and if you're not optimizing it, then you're really just kind of like taking a lot of these things laying down. You're taking FedEx increases, you're taking corrugated increases, you're taking all of these things rather than just being proactive and kind of trying to influence the outcomes of the current environment, which is very dynamic and kind of always changing. So did want to cover just a few of the packaging automation myths, right? So, first, while I did show several e-commerce examples or direct-to-consumer examples, just know that there are machines and, Packsize, others have machines that are great in the manufacturing environment. The impacts are actually higher in the manufacturing environment. They do work for, big heavy items. They do work for B2B shipments, wholesale shipments. It's not just online orders. Also, some will look at this and say, yeah, well, it's just too expensive to implement. But there are scalable systems out there. Packsize also does provide packaging as a service. There's also, other people in which you can, go and finance equipment, and do more of a lease to own option. But there's a lot of different ways. And really, our barrier of entry is about $125,000 in corrugated spend, where this starts to make sense for both Packsize and, and our customers. So the third one, I think, is kind of the biggest one that I hear the most is, well, our carrier rates are very good. Well, who told you your carrier rates were good? Well, it was FedEx or UPS. Okay. Well, I'm here to tell you that, most of the time I've never seen a simulation run where there was an increase in parcel spend. There's always a savings. Doesn't matter how competitive your rates are, doesn't matter how many times you beat up FedEx and UPS, there is always room for improvement because really FedEx and UPS knows what's coming in. They know where their sweet spots are. They know what to squeeze, what not to. And, they're playing the same game, but it's like your rates are really not going to save you. And there's always, as long as North America stays on like a, dimensional weight type of setup, there's always going to be, room for improvement. And then the last one is just that you need exact item dimensions to automate. Most of the time, that is true, but there are also, ways or software that, that Packsize can provide in conjunction with Packurate to allow you to build your, to build a dimensional database, which, depending on SKU count, doesn't take you all that long, kind of in the grand scheme of things. But then there's also plenty of other pieces of equipment, including ones, in Packsize's lineup that allow you to scan the items on induction and take dynamic dimensions and really kind of be able to wrap the carton around the actual box itself. So, with this, really, if you're curious about this, or if you just want to see like, okay, how does this pertain to my product set, then you can reach out to Packsize or to Packurate, right? With Packsize, we're obviously going to look at like what does going full on demand look like, but with Packurate, they can help you and just say, okay, well, maybe it makes sense that you only need 10 box sizes because you ship a lot of similarly sized or weighted type products. But if you would like to learn more about it, we've got a QR code, and then I have seen some other kind of contact us things on the previous session. So happy to help, and we can do it quick. We can do it within 3 days as long as your order information is kind of in the right format. So yeah, thank you for your time. I'll kind of turn it over to Q&A. So
all right, thanks, Cam. Another great session, great insight. I mean, it amazes me, like that couple of the numbers you threw out there, right? 13%, right? Increases for UPS and FedEx and stuff this year, and it just continues, right? Over the years, it just continues. So we've got a couple questions that kind of relate to that, and then also just what's going on regulation wise with PPWR, right, over in Europe, and then all the states that are starting to implement stuff here. So it's going to be interesting landscape here over the next couple of years. So, all right. So the first question that we've got is, do you have any results from Packsize packing data and carrier return of charges from the parcel audit?
Little bit different, I guess, viewpoint, right? When we say parcel audit, we're kind of, we are evaluating the impacts of carton choice, right? We're not necessarily saying, okay, like, hey, you had a SLA failure or things like that. I think that that's what your question is, Stu. But yeah, if you'd like to discuss more, I'm happy to, happy to have a conversation offline.
Okay. In your presentation, you talked about the skyrocketing cost of doing nothing, right? Kind of the whole status quo piece of things. So what indicators should operations team, look for that suggest that they're leaving money on the table when it comes to packaging?
Sure. I would say overall, if there's a disproportionate amount of people packing comparing to your picking labor, like that is one indication that you could probably optimize. You have more people packing than you do picking, or if it's even relatively equal, you probably some room for improvement there from a labor perspective. The second is just visual inspection, and it's like if you have, let's say, over 1.5 lines per order, and you are, and you're dealing with a lot of multis, then, go look at 20 packages, right? Go take a look and just see how much error you physically see with your own two eyes, right? And if you wanted to take a step further, then, with a relatively light lift, WMS pull, we can tell you exactly what it looks like too.
Okay. And going back to PPWR and some of the regulations here in the states, right? We expect more and more states probably to come up. So do you see an effect from UPS and FedEx on rates as a result of this stuff coming down the pike?
Hard to predict, right? And UPS and FedEx, I guess, just to say it, like they are great companies, and they have done a lot, and they've invested a lot of infrastructure to serve the American public. But overall, like they still need to maintain profitability. So the question is like, will the goalposts move? Yes, they will, right? And as packages get optimized, then either the penalties for not being optimized will continue to increase as an offset, or they will come up with with a different way in a different billing category. But overall, like I think the sustainability impact still remains the same, and they're as they go, so will we.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. All right. So do you see any challenge, or what are the challenges you typically see when implementing Packsize either by itself or in conjunction with Packyard?
Sure. I think number one is priority. Like that's, we aren't necessarily like, losing to, other packaging technologies, so to speak. It's just more of like, okay, well, we have this problem. We've got picking that we need to solve first, right? Or we're in the middle of a WMS implementation, and so it's usually status quo. That's the biggest problem, right? And just kind of doing nothing, right? But then the second part is, really around just kind of some of the infrastructure, right? And a lot of it is, certain WMS providers are very willing to, kind of, play ball, so to speak, but others, want you to use their kind of cartonization software. And if you're going box first, right, you need quality cartonization. So, there can be just maybe too stiff of, project management fees to switch to something else, or integration fees, can be expensive. And then the next one is just, the most common barrier is really just, lack of, wanting to go box first, but maybe not having all your product dimensions, right? And then just not knowing the answer there. But, there are answers. There are companies that, will send out temp labor that are, provide this as a service that can create, databases that exist. And there's plenty of different options, right, that are relatively turnkey to help you solve that problem.
All right. Awesome. All right. I think that's going to close this one out for right now. Cam, again, thank you. Awesome information. Thanks everybody for participating in this session with Cartonize. joining the next session, like I said, there's a link in the far right of the console that'll take you there directly. We got ProShip talking about customer retention. And then we close out with Cardex with the exponential value of AutoStore. So look forward to seeing everybody on the next sessions. And again, thank you everybody for jumping in today.
Great. Thanks, Tony.